wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful
Guyana will become the next Dubai, and we, the citizens of Guyana, are super excited to benefit from our homeland the same way the citizens of Dubai benefit from theirs.
This is what life is like for citizens from the Emirate of Dubai. When you are born, your parents pay nothing. Your delivery and checkups for the next 9 months are all free. Then you grow up and you go to school. Local school in Dubai is free. And so are universities, because Dubai will pay for you to get a degree.
I studied at Zayed University and New York University, both for free.
Who's gonna pay for that?
The government.
Then you get married. If you can't afford the wedding, you get $20,000 to throw a wedding. And after marriage, every local Dubai family gets this: free land. Did you get free land?
Yes.
Did you get free land?
Yes.
Did you get free land?
Sure, yes.
And if you cannot afford the home, then you get a grant to build it for free.
I also can't afford building a house. I can get a 0-interest loan on housing.
Zero?
Zero.
If you need to go to the hospitals are free. And if you need surgery that's not available here, they will fly you to another country to get treatment for free. When you become a senior citizen, you get discounts, many discounts. And if you live alone and can't afford it, Dubai will even send a caretaker to look after you for free. And when you die, well, in Dubai, that's also free. Your funeral will be taken care of, and Dubai will build a full tent with air conditioning within 5 hours of your death next to your home, so your friends can come and say goodbye to you.
Guyana will become the next Dubai.
with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful Guyana.
So welcome viewers, listeners to another edition of Globespan 24x7, owned and operated by Mr. Noor Singh, with Mr. Devin Bissoon as our technical operator. Tonight is May 3rd, tomorrow is 4th, and Friday is the 5th. May 5th is a very significant day in Guyana. It is the day or date in which, in the year 1838, Indians from India first landed in then British Guyana under an indentureship contract that later came to be known as the Girmitia contract, or Girmit, agreement. Today we are discussing Indian Arrival Day and its implications for Guyana, what it means for Guyana, and so forth. And we have three very distinguished presenters: Mr. Ravindra Dev, former member of Parliament and leader of ROAR; Professor Dr. Baytoram Ramharack, who teaches in New York in political science and social sciences; and Mr. Vincent Alexander, who is currently Commissioner of GCOM, Guyana Elections Commission. Gentlemen, welcome all. Thank you for joining us tonight for us to have an informed and enlightened discussion on Indian Arrival Day in Guyana. Before we proceed, I was thinking perhaps we could have some background from either the eminent scholar among us, Dr. Baytoram Ramharack, or Ravindra Dev, who served in Parliament for a period of time, to give us a little background on what is Indian Arrival Day, and what is this fuss about of recognizing Indian Arrival Day. Either one of you can go first. I think Ravindra Dev first.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it, having been in the committee that
took evidence and pronounced on the matter back in 2004, I believe. But before I talk about the actual occasion that is being commemorated, I'd like to offer a perspective in what is called memory politics, because Indian Arrival Day is caught up in the politics of Guyana. And in looking back, we're talking about either history or memory. They aren't necessarily the same. History, we can talk about, historians may give a chronicle of what happened. But in politics and in memorialization and remembrance, it's more of what has been transmitted into the minds of the people, the actors in politics. And it certainly has relevance in the present as articulated in various ideologies or various positions that has political implications. Now, this isn't anything new. This has been a field that goes back almost a century. But of recent, there's been a work coming out of Eastern Europe. There's two scholars, Bernhard and the other fellow is Rubik, I think he is, that they looked at how 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, how is it being commemorated? And they look at the political implications, and I like to put our discussion into that framework. They put forward that there's four possible set of people who could be looking at history for political purposes. There are some who are political, they call them memory warriors. There is talk about mnemonic warriors, but I'll call it memory warriors. These are people in a plural society who only look at their politics from one perspective, and they consider that perspective to be the only valid one, and nothing else is acceptable and should not be tolerated. They're called memory warriors. There's another called memory pluralists, mnemonic pluralists. These are individuals, activists who accept that in a plural society, there will be different views, different memories that are invoked, and that we must accept them. They may be different, but at least we may accept them. There are some who are memory abdicators. They pretend as if there's no point in talking about history and all that, man. You know how. And there are some Marxists who would, and I'm not going to call names in Guyana, but there are some Marxists who give very short shrift to this cultural need to be looking back. They're memory abdicators. And they see people who talk about remembrance as troublemakers. Well, you are bringing up this thing. Never mind that it has to do with how people define their own lives. And very lastly, there's a very rare breed called memory prospectives. These are people who try to combine the various views into a unitary narrative for the nation. So I would like to propose that most of us, I hope, are at least memory pluralists, that we will accept that there may be different views. But one of our very good friends, he has openly declared himself in replying to me that he's a memory warrior in Guyana, meaning his view and only his view is coherent. So with that, I want to go over to what Vishnu has asked me to talk about, Indian Arrival Day, where a group of us many years ago were in contact with those in Trinidad who agitated for and was able, back in the 1970s, and was able to have Indian Arrival Day memorialized as a holiday in that island. And I remember both Baytoram and Vishnu and a group of us in New York, we were a member of Indo-Caribbean Federation. And we actually changed the name. Up to then it was called Indian Immigration Day. And we changed it to Indian Arrival Day. And it's significant. So coming back to Guyana, when we arrived back with at the Jaguar Committee for Democracy, and then ROAR, we agitated for this day to be remembered. And I'll tell you why, and I think it has to do with how we see things. That Indian Immigration Day, when you talk about immigration, it casts your eyes outwards towards the source. You have immigrated from there. Indian Arrival Day changes the whole focus and talks and accepts that you have now arrived at a particular place. And in doing so, you are now home. This is now our home. And for those Indian indentured who remained in Guyana, the 79% or so that remained in Guyana of the 239,000 who came, it is they who saw it as having arrived at a particular place. And that, of course, has tremendous implications. And I guess we will talk about it. But to finish the story in terms of Indian Arrival Day, after the agitation, there was a tremendous kickback from certain groups in the society. And I remember the Stabrook News took a lead in denying that there ought to be such a day. And there was a whole back and forth thing. I played a part in that. But the committee was set up, and every one of those who gave testimonials, gave evidence, agreed that there ought to be a holiday. Some proposed there may be some other holidays. But it is important to note that the persons who gave testimony and the committee recommended that the day become a holiday and that it be called Indian Arrival Day. However, the mandate that was given to the committee, and the committee took note of it, was for Arrival Day. So the committee then wrote that even though they only have the mandate to talk about Arrival Day, and they will do so, they are recommending that the holiday be called Indian Arrival Day. It went back to Parliament. It was approved unanimously. Some of us talked about Indian Arrival Day and that it ought to be Indian Arrival Day, but it was passed by a majority by the PPP as Arrival Day, and that it remains to this day.
Dr. Ramharack, you want to elaborate on that? Why are we observing and how are we observing Indian Arrival Day?
Well, but that's a very good synopsis, right, of that historical evolution from 1838. But there are a couple of things I just want to, if not reiterate, at least reinforce. One is that, obviously, except for the Native Americans, the Amerindians, we're all comers to this society. Obviously, we do remember, or we should, that Africans have moved about 100 million tons of dati to humanize the landscape in which we live, because Guyana is underwater. But the fact still remains that others have also come to this land, the Chinese, the Portuguese, the Indians, and we have made tremendous contributions. So when we think of Indian Arrival Day, for me, you're looking at things like the achievements that have transpired over the years, especially the Indian contribution. I'm talking about things like the sugar industry, the rice industry, and so on. There's a very good analysis given by Clem C. Charan in his book, Tiger and the Stars, which focuses on the development among Indians and the economic contribution that they have made in the 1920s. However, the second point I do want to make is that since we're coming from different time periods and different arrival, the whole notion of prior arrival does have connotation for some people, right? It's who came first and who did what first and who created what first becomes significant, and that in itself is a basis for some of the conflicts we are seeing today. Because I do remember in the 1980s when we were engaged in this discussion, the issue of prior arrival played a significant contribution in terms of how we can address this issue, right? So So from that arrival, when you fast forward to contemporary Guyana, we're seeing a society, despite what some people may echo today, it is still a divided society, much more divided. And of course, that compartmentalization that was spoken about by people like Brian Moore occurred, over time, because we were kept in separate locations, separate communities, and performed different functions and so on. I think the other point I do want to make is that for me, when we talk about Indian Arrival Day, it's more of a broader issue for me. It's more of a recognition, right? Some people will say, well, why do you need to celebrate Indian Arrival? Well, you could celebrate Indian Arrival, but the day also has significant impact. I mean, it is in a letter I've written to Stabroek News. Here's an example of something that is unique about Indians being here in British Guyana. For one, you're looking at the country where most of the Girmitias, indentured laborers, came in this region. Obviously, that started a couple of years before in Mauritius. But you have two ships have actually landed on the very day. They left on different days, but they landed on the same day. So we have become a significant part of the population. We can say, well, we are one of the minority population in Guyana, but at a certain point by 1911, Indians have become the majority of Guyana up to the 1980s. And of course, we know what happened in the 1980s, faced with political issues and so on, political pressure, the population has been reduced. But this is the final point I do want to make. And again, this is where I would hope the discussion would go, in the sense that Indian Arrival Day, we know what the issue is. So the question in my mind is, why is there so much conflict over this day? Why is there's so much conflict over naming it Indian Arrival Day? I mean, they don't seem to have a problem in neighboring Grenada or neighboring Suriname or Trinidad. I mean, it was a struggle there, but we seem to have, obviously we have a longer history of Indians being in this country, but the struggle seems to be a much more protracted struggle for us, or at least those who would like to have Indian Arrival Day, being seen as a day of importance in terms of, having Indians being recognized for the contributions that they've made in Guyana. So the final point I would make, and in the form of a question, is that, why is it that, as Mr. Dev has described, why is this rigmarole, this sort of, back and forth, this fear of not willing, especially with the government in place that is being supported by the majority of Indians. We know Mr. Norton of the PNC has no problem with this, naming this day Indian Arrival Day. He said so. But yet we still have this continuous issue of a government that is unwilling to accept the fact that this should be something that we should call Indian Arrival Day, and that to me will go a long way. But let me just say one more thing, and I think this was the point I started to make, but I want to leave my comments with this last point that I want to make. I think the whole issue of Indian Arrival Day must also be seen in the backdrop of a sort of an attempt, whether deliberate or not, an attempt to minimize the Indian contribution in Guyana. I think it's a cultural thing. It's a political issue. When I say it's a cultural thing, it's been celebrated going back to the 1930s by people who were very much involved in expressing themselves as an ethnic community, right? And I'm going back to the 1930s. So this whole notion of recognizing this day has always been there. So that's one aspect of this. But my point is there are other aspects of Indian contribution which is not being given that national recognition. So we are still fighting for a cultural space for Indians. And I will leave it at that.
All right, just before Mr. Alexander comes on, Initially, it was called Ramakan Day to celebrate Ram and Khan, who stepped on then British Guyana, and then it became Immigration Day, as Ravi pointed out, and finally Indian Arrival Day. At least among those of us who are from New York and who's initiated that terminology and celebration. And one other point. Indian indentureship first started in Reunion Island, then French Reunion Island, still is a French island, 1828, 1834 in Mauritius, 1838 in Guyana, 1845 in Trinidad, and Indians were also taken to several other territories, neighboring Dutch Guyana, French Guyana, Martinique, Guadeloupe, St. Vincent, St. Croix, Grenada, Jamaica, and so forth. In all of these places, it is known and called Indian Immigration Day or Indian Arrival Day or Indian Heritage Day, and some of the islands even have Indian Heritage Month. So I just want to put that into the background. Mr. Alexander, feel free to talk about how and why Indians first came to Guyana, and you could also talk about slavery, because slavery, as Dr. Ramharack pointed out, humanized the land and made it possible, and its abolition of slavery led to the arrival of the Portuguese, the Chinese, the Indians, and others as well. We must not forget that there were also African indentured laborers as well.
Thank you very much. I can see no rational argument against the day being referred to as Indian Arrival Day. It's simply, in the first instance, a statement of fact that in our history, there was a point in time when we had the arrival of Indians. Of course, it was a continuous exercise over time, but in history, there are moments, and one must be able to acknowledge those moments. And one of the moments that's significant in our history is the arrival of Indians. And so I can't see a rational argument against Indian Arrival Day. But you know what I find interesting as this question about Arrival Day as opposed to Indian Arrival Day, that we seem for some reason, some of us for some reason, to have some kind of denial that we do not explain or cannot explain because it's denial. And I say that to say this. When we were doing the constitutional reform process and the Amerindians sought to have enshrined themselves as the indigenous people, there was a resistance to that as well. And so today, officially, we still talk about Amerindians as opposed to the indigenous people. And here we have this problem now, where, well, not now, but we have this problem as well, where we don't want to refer to this day as Indian Arrival Day, and as some arrival day, as if not to be able to recognize the plurality of our society, recognize the different moments in our society, because Indian Arrival Day is a different moment to African Arrival Day, to European Arrival Day, to Portuguese Arrival Day, to Chinese Arrival Day. They're all different. And so one cannot just talk about Arrival Day, particularly if the day in question is historically the day when Indians arrived. So this is not a day that is put aside to call Arrival Day because we want to talk about the arrival of everyone. It's a day that is specific to the arrival of a certain set of people, and therefore I can hardly find a reason why one should not call it an Arrival Day. But I think that those who do not want to do so, they do not want to recognize, in many regards, the plurality of our society. And this gets us into some regards the political realm. There are some people who would like to suggest that, you know, they don't really want to speak to the diversity in our society. And that's again an instance where they don't want to recognize the facts of our existence, that we are a diverse people. And so those who do not advocate for Indian Arrival Day seem to have a perspective.
Mr. Alexander.
Yes? You not hearing me?
I can hear you.
I'm not being heard?
I'm hearing you.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Right. They seem not to want to accept, have a different perspective on the Guyana which we live in, so that not accepting Indian Arrival Day is a reflection of the non-acceptance, not only of the fact that we should recognize the Indian arrival, but a non-acceptance of a number of other things that could be equated in terms of how they should be seen to Indian Arrival Day. So I think it's very, very apt that the day be referred to Indian Arrival Day. And I noticed, for example, that during the period of President Granger, he went beyond Indian Arrival Day and even started to emphasize the arrival day of the Portuguese, the arrival day of the Chinese, and certainly in a plural society, those are historical moments which I think ought to be recognized.
Okay, so Mr. Ravidev,
Well,
would you like to add to anything, and then we'll talk
yes,
about the
yeah. I want to put it within the framework, and that's why I'm saying, ultimately, Beto and Vincent, I guess, are being a bit kind. Ultimately, it's a political question, and a political question means that there are political reasons, at least perceived political reasons, why it's not being called Indian Arrival Day. And you know, we can look at them, but from the framework I've offered, I would like to suggest that what is in play here are what you call memory abnegators. They want to, in some way, put out a view as if, as Vincent said, these moments did not occur. Somehow then we are one people, you know, as if we might not have arrived here at various times from various places, and that has its own dynamic and implications that we should deal with. And to close one's eyes to that by just giving it a name, you know, definitional ontology has never worked. Just because you define it, you know, a particular way, that doesn't mean that is what it is. And we can see in the lives of our people, it is not so. You can't define a people's identity and all that it implies for just by saying so. And I think part of the reason is that's why we have certain conflicts in this. So I would say it comes out of being memory abdicators rather than being memory pluralists, to accept at the minimum. But you know how we have these various groups that came in here, and let's see what it happened. Let's see if there are these differences, how can we deal with them? But I want to point out an irony that all of us, or most of us, and Beto has written about it, may think of Cherry Jagan as somehow being one of these applicators, that he applicated, you know, this whole arrival thing and what have you. But in 1988, the year in which slavery finally ended, 1838. Did I say 1938 before? 1838. Well, some may say it still was up to 1930. Be as it may, in 1838, it finally ended. But also in 1838, it was the Indians who first arrived. Interestingly, the Portuguese had come before. Some Africans from Africa, from Sierra Leone, had come before. Some Africans from the Caribbean had come before. But it is Indians from India who arrived in 1838. So there was a conference in 1838, and it was called, sponsored by the Desmond Hoyt government, that was in power then. It was called Genesis of a Nation, a very interesting name for the conference. Ali Mazrui came down, but what I found interesting, there were two papers that we should put back into the Guyana reading public. There was a paper by Desmond Hoyt called Beyond the Boundary, Looking Beyond the Boundary, where he analyzed the African Guyanese condition, because it was their emancipation 100 years before. He analyzed their condition and talked about why some of the problems that they may have ought to be so. And I think it's one of the most pertinent analysis that has come out in Guyana. And I say it very, very clearly. People forget that Mr. Hoyt was a historian, was trained as a historian in his first degree. Coming back to it, another paper was prepared by Dr. Jagan, assisted by Moses Nagamutu. And he talked, and his paper was called, it had to do with Indians and Africans and the nation. And in his paper was a two-part. He talked about the Indians' arrival and of the Africans' arrival. And I think therefore, Dr. Jagan, at the minimum, did not have a problem with the arrival of Indians. And it is a very, very interesting analysis. We must look at it. For example, he talked about a popular thing as to why do Indians cheer, and you're criticized for it, when the Indian cricket team visits, or the Pakistani cricket team visits the Caribbean. And he said very clearly that Indians cheer because they feel themselves excluded from the definition of West Indian and Guyanese nationalism. And that is why they're forced to then identify back from where they came. And I saw, and he referred that the same thing happens in England. And I was there in England in 1985, and I want to conclude. I went there when Gordon Greenidge was to make his double century at Lord's. And I sat on the mound, their mound, on the ground, with a bunch of young Afro-Caribbean people. And they all cheered when Greenidge was hitting that ball, when he was on his way to make a century. And we chatted, I chatted with those young people. All of them, most of them were born in England. And at the same point they made that Chetty made, is that the English did not make them feel as English people. And therefore, if you're going to define me in a particular way, then I'm going to define myself by that way, at least partially. So it come back to say that that is not something Jagan would have been taught, but he's there, he did it. So yet I'm finding it very difficult that the present government, the inheritors of the legacy of Dr. Jagan, find it difficult to accept this historicity of the arrival of Indians, and it still isn't been called Indian Arrival Day.
Just note that Desmond Hoyt did declare a holiday May 5th, 1988, and I believe the Vice President of India had also journeyed to Guyana to commemorate that historic occasion of 150th anniversary.
But it was of both end of slavery and Indian arrival. It wasn't one. It was called Genesis of a Nation. Like I say, it was a big to-do. Vincent was probably there.
No, I know of that that conference.
You weren't there?
Yes, I had returned by then. And it was quite a momentous occasion in Guyana.
Mm-hmm.
That conference was held at the Culture Center. Sought, in fact, to give recognition to the kaleidoscope that Guyana had become with the various presentations. I do remember as well, I think Lloyd Sewar was very, very much involved and instrumental in that conference. There was even a secretariat. It was really a big activity.
Yes.
Period of celebration. And there was a secretariat. I remember Mary McKeever came for that conference. Well, she performed at the National Park on that occasion as well. But it certainly sought to give recognition, though it was around the period for emancipation, it sought to give recognition to a kind of the emancipation of the peoples who would have come and settled in Guyana.
Genesis of a nation, it says.
Dr. Ramharack?
Well, okay, so let's be a little frank, and I want to make myself very clear because I like to channel these discussion into very specific areas. So I'm going to make a statement that I think we can all agree, but frankly, the only people standing in the way of having an Indian arrival day is the PPP. I think we have established that it can be done by the stroke of a pen. So therefore, the logical question is why? Why is that being done? Even though Chetty Jagan had recognized it, Norton had, says he will support it and so on. And I think to kind of figure out an answer.
Let me just say, as a member of the committee, the PNC and the African groups like ACDA also went along to recognize that the day should be Indian Arrival Day.
Yes, so then it comes back to the question, what is the problem? So I think for us to get the answer to this, we kind of have to go back a little bit. Of course, it's probably political in people's mind because I think the PPP is scared to death of touching anything that has to do with Indian. And I think Indian Arrival Day is an easy one where they can actually be able to do that without having any major issues from society. But as I said before, I think the issue also has to do with this whole broader concept of who we are. And going back to that notion of this sort of a denial of the Indian presence in Guyana. And I think if we go back and look at go back to the 1950s and 60s, well, first to begin, we don't have today, there's just a handful of people who are publicly calling for Indian Arrival Day. We don't have very strong organizations. IPARA may have maybe 55 plus organizations, and Vincent can correct me about the numbers, but we don't have many significant Indian organizations that focus specifically in Guyana on Indian issues. So we don't have that very strong voice coming from an organizational group. So that's one major issue. And the reason is because the PPP has actually co-opted any of those groups that existed in the past. So in a sense, Indians expect the PPP to speak on their behalf. But the problem, as I said, is they seem to not to want to touch anything that symbolizes anything that has to do with Indians, right? Compare that to the statement made by, let's say, Mark Phillips, right? Who understands his African background and so on. You don't have those kind of statements coming from political leaders in the PPP. So, but I want to go back to what I said before about, and I don't just want to knock the PPP. There's a history to this thing. When you look at this from a cultural perspective, if you go back to the old days, let's say in 1958, when Brindley Ben, was the Minister of Education, he came up with this whole notion of, one people, one nation, one destiny. As opposed to something like, we are a very diversified society, so we can go with something like unity and diversity. But I believe what Ben was saying at that time, when you look at the wording, and this is, I believe, a presentation he made in October 58 about one Guyana, where he said all of the cultural groups must be meshed together. And again, this is a guy who's coming from a Marxist perspective. Now, go back a few years before that, the whole idea of cultural groups were seen as anathema. In other words, you could not be promoting a specific cultural identity and talk about working class or, working class unity. So you have a period where those organizations were, in a sense, delegitimized. So to come back to the 1950s now, this whole notion of one Guyana is not new. Right? But at that time, I believe it was an attempt to create a whole new culture. Now, when you have the PNC taking hold, and you have this whole idea of Carifesta in the Guyana context, it was the Guy Festa, right? A tribute to Forbes Barnum. You have a large Creole community playing a major role. One of the things that they did was just create a magazine, for instance, called, well, there was Kai Overall, but there was also Kai, short version of Kai Overall. And you had a sort of a cultural attempt. People like Vincent were talking about revolutionary culture, but it was all an attempt to kind of create support for the regime, right? So a sort of a Creole culture was being promoted, and the Indian voice was not there. Now, granted, I will agree that Indians don't try to monetize, right, what they do and promote their culture in a sense, you know, where you can make it into a national phenomena. And we're seeing this today when you have people like Mahadev, I forget the name, I think it was Mahadev Shivraj, right? And you have Terry Gajraj talking about the fact that they have done so much to promote Guyana, but they're not given the recognition, right? So I see this as a much broader cultural phenomenon to deny that the Indian presence. But to finish the point I'm trying to make is that when the Creole dominated, you know, this whole cultural business, and especially in the late 60s, 1970s, of course, you had people like, you know, Rajkumari Singh and Maharaj Das and so on, but their role were minimal, right? In fact, Rajkumari Singh later left. You know, she was very much involved in the cultural part of national service, for instance. And she said, I think the quote was, "I will not allow the Damocles sword of military censure to daunt me from my, you know, from my duty." In other words, she was saying, look, this whole notion of promoting Indian culture started out okay, but now we're seeing a domination of this sort of a Creole culture with some very famous people, you know, people like A.J. Seymour and, you know, Wilson Harris, Jan Carew, and Mettelhauser, and so on. So these people were able to make a name for themselves, but the Indian voice was not there, right? Now, granted, there was an opening for some Indians, you know, as I said, Rajkumari Singh would have been one of them, Maharaj Das, Sesnarayan Prasad, and so on. But you'd have that, you know, situation taking place where the Indian culture was not given that sort of exposure. It was seen as backward, right? It was not given that, you know, national space. So now, coupled with that, fast forward to today, we're seeing some of the same scenarios being played out, where we still have that struggle, right, for that cultural space. Thus, we are fighting for Indian, you know, arrival day. But at the national level, the Indian cultural space is still minimized. When you look at the organizations that promote a legitimate Guyanese culture, I'm talking about, you know, the National School of Dance, the E.R. Burroughs School of Art, the National School of Music, the Theater, Arts and Dance. All of these organizations don't have necessarily a sort of an Indian element in there. So we're not seeing that. So at the national level, that continues. Coupled with that, we have a government that really believe, and I think really believe in what Brinley Ben had advocated, which is that a one Guyana means creating a culture that is totally different from this diversity that we have that reflects the population of all Guyanese. So that element is not there, especially when you talk about issues like, well, you know, we don't have a race issue today. So therefore, why promote diversity? But diversity is what we are, right? And that's part of where we are. So I think that, in a sense, gives us a sort of a historical perspective, in my view, as to why Indian Arrival Day is not being seen as something that this government should address, because it is part of that tradition. And again, I'm saying the PNC is guilty of that. I'm saying the PPP is certainly guilty of that, because for them, you know, since they control the reins of power, and everybody else seems to agree, even Vincent Alexander agreed that we should call this thing Indian Arrival Day. Arrival Day. What is the problem, right? And how do we, you know, how do we rationalize this thing? This continued refusal, right? And as I said before, I think there is a fear among Indians, and always been a fear. And I think even Chetty had that fear that when you address Indian issues, as opposed to talking about class, then it's an uncomfortable situation for Indians to address themselves as Indians and talk about their own concerns. I'm not seeing that today with this government. Maybe they're doing it behind the scenes in private, but we don't see that national debate where Indians can feel, free to express their concern in a rational way, like the way we are doing it here. And I think that's the tragedy. So I am laying the blame squarely on the feet of this government, where I think it should be.
I think that Baytoram has raised what I would consider a very complex issue. But I would agree with Ravi that at the center of this issue is politics. I say that because this whole question would have started with the colonization process and the process of acculturation, which would have sought to Anglicize all of us, and therefore not give emphasis and recognition to us in our own right. But it is a dichotomy, because even as I say that, the same colonizers sought to provide some degree of preservation, some degree of preservation, and for others, they sought to bring them into mainstream Western culture in a way that lent to division that was not the natural division based on our ethnicity, which speaks to belief systems and culture and things like that, but a division which was kind of engineered that facilitated control. And so in the colonial period, I think there was that situation, which has continued beyond the colonial period. In a situation where there is denial which seeks to suggest that we are one, and therefore to say anything otherwise is an act of division. So, but that too, in many regards, is political, because it seeks to create a facade of the kind of ethnic political dominance that we've had. So, whilst under the colonial system, it sought to kind of divide us and create a framework in which we could be ruled by division. In the current post-independence period, it is a division which sought to, it's a facade that sought to suggest, we don't have that division, and therefore not allow us to interrogate the kind of emergent, at that time, political landscape where there was not only, but there was ethnic political dominance, so to speak. And it takes me back again to the point I made earlier about why is it also the denial of speaking to the first peoples, indigenous peoples, and talking about Amerindians. It seems to be an attempt not to identify the specific contributions of these people. So if you're the first people, there's something about that in terms of what Guyana is and who they are. And so similarly, if you speak about Indian arrival, it also speaks about what Guyana is and who they are. So it seeks to create that, what I call artificial bringing together of a people, but at the same time, whilst there's that artificial bringing together, in reality, the division persists, and it that persistence facilitates political ethnic domination as well. But I also want to make the point that even as we talk about the way in which the British, for example, through the school system, sought to anglicize everybody. You didn't have an English name, you couldn't go to the schools and all of that. You actually had to join the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church, so they sought to anglicize everybody. But interestingly, even as they sought to do that, the manner of suppression of groups differed. And so, for example, the people of African descent, the manner of oppression was to obliterate all that was African, just didn't exist in terms of the culture, the religion, just didn't exist. In terms of the Indo-Guyanese, there was some tolerance of the Hindu religion, some tolerance of that, a part of the, I would say, the divide and rule mechanism. As well, a part of the divide and rule mechanism as well. So there was that tolerance, even in the face of an attempt to anglicize. And that tolerance was intended to pit one group in some regards against the other, even as we attempted to monopolize the cultural landscape with what was European and an emergent Creole culture. So I think it's a very complex situation, but at the end of the day, all oscillates around politics of the colonizers on one hand, and the politics of the political actors post-independence. And this attempt, particularly post-independence, to portray the party as if it's national, as if it represents all interests, when in fact, that was a facade for what the party actually would have been, one representing ethnic dominance.
So Ravi, you want to comment on what both Professor Ramharack and Vincent talked about, and then after that we can talk about the implications of Indian Arrival Day.
Yeah, I just want to maybe put it in a historical context. Coming back to Vincent and Beto's point, Vincent emphasized the job of the British, which hegemonized or attempted to hegemonize us in terms of what was in the real meaning of the word hegemony, to get into your head, to define what is moral and what is philosophically okay, and that you will adhere to those standards. And certainly, R.T. Smith calls it, we develop what is called a white bias culture. So up to the 40s and the 50s, in the Indian section, you had J.B. Singh, who Beto has written a 500-word book, and he has now written a 600-word page book on the wife. But let us look as to what those two represented in terms of culture. Both of them aspired to quote unquote polish up Indian culture, to polish up, take that Bengali Babu that we sang down in the lojis. I remember singing it as a boy. Oh Maninja, you know, what you do, rice and flour, dear a shop, where you do a tal. That kind of culture the Singhs didn't see that as culture. So they would put on archaic Sanskrit plays like Savitri. So in a sense, they took the high culture, coming back to what the British called high culture, approach to what is Indian culture, but that was alienated from the people down at the bottom. They couldn't see themselves in that. So they were appealing to a Georgetown crowd where you had the Tate family, you know, with the Vicara lodges, the Tate House, and they represented what was we call the colored culture, and they represented supposedly what that section was supposed to be all about, which was to be even more British than the British. The British didn't wear all those suit and tie when they went out into the fields, but those fellas went. The African headmaster, when he went around, you know, the village schools, would be bedecked in his three-piece suit and with his tie, showing the villagers what was proper. So up to the 40s, you would have that. So you have, for example, in a political sense, you have the League of Colored People, which represented that colored class of British values that all blacks were supposed to aspire to, actually coming to form a party with J.B. Singh's, the Labour Party, with J.B. Singh group for the 1947 election. So that high culture then was seen as Indian. So coming back to what was on the ground, we have to acknowledge that UC Guyana, from the African side, made a radical break from all of that when he talked about authentic African culture, which was always there. Because after the abolition of slavery, we knew 13,355 Africans, so-called liberated Africans, were brought. And in my part of the country, going back to West Bank, Bagotville, and so on, you had many of them there. Some of them were Congo people. You had people from Kru nation in West Africa, they came. So that was there. So UC Guyana made a radical break with what is proper culture of the people. Because if culture is supposed to be your way of life, you can't adopt a culture which defines you as second class, and of course then second rate. Because no matter how you try to ape the British, you would never be that. In fact, there's a novel of that era where this African guy with his suit and tie is going to Africa, is going to England, because all civil servants got a passage to England. And so the white fella asked him, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going home." So the white guy looks at him, "Going to Africa, eh?" You know, it wasn't even a subtle dig that you're not British, you're African. So the point is, though, that UC Guyana made a radical break in terms of where culture is located, and to adopt a culture, to see a culture which you will now define as to who you are. Beto, I think it needs investigation to answer your question. We never developed the equivalent of a UC Guyana in between the 1950s and 1988, when Jagan modified his views. That whole gap there, you did not have an individual who defined the cultural aspirations politically. We have to remember that Guyana joined the PNC on sufferance. You understand? He existed within the PNC by his rules, and he was expelled in '62 because he made a position for what he considered to be for the African people. And he left by 72, 73, he left because he said the PNC was overtaken by Portuguese and Indian capitalists. That was the formation of ASCUIA. So to come back to it all, we have to then interrogate, why is it within the Indian section, culture as politics, and they can never be disjunctured. All culture is politics. Nobody can tell you differently, because if culture is your way of life and politics define how you ought to live, then you can't disjuncture them. So to come back to it, that is the interesting question. Why is it that within the Indian section, there was not an equivalent Guyana? And that is a very, so I will come back and leave it there and come back. Over to you, Bisram.
Okay, so Dr. Ram,
Well,
amplifying both preceding speakers discussed.
well, I mean, we can go back and talk about, 60, 70 years ago, when you had divide and rule in its highest form. But the point is, we are living in a society where you would expect, a generation now, people are much smarter, right? They're seeing things differently, and so on. So you can reflect on some of the things that happen. So my point is, you can be a Guyana Babu and at the same time being a Bengali Babu. I don't see any contradiction. I think one has to do with nationality, being a citizen, and the other has to do with being, a person who shares a certain origin, background, culture, religion, and all the different cultural traits you can talk about. So I don't see any issue. Yeah, well, let's all agree that it is, culture is politics. Well, the point is, why not flip the coin and say, if culture is politics, if you are able with the stroke of a pen to say May 5th, this is my presentation, be like, David Granger and say, this is Indian Arrival Day, and we will celebrate and recognize the Indian contribution. If Irfan Ali was to come out and say that and make the statement that this is an example of what one Guyana can be, a diverse, but one Guyana. To me, politics will serve in their favor because you're taking something that's in a sense cultural and in a sense politicize it if you want to go that route, and that will at least bring some kind of support for this government. It was Shetty I have a quote here from 1995 where he basically said, it is only by combining the two, unity and diversity, together in a single overarching whole, can Guyanese recognize who they are as one people, one nation with a common destiny. So there is no contradiction between what is one Guyana and what can be a plurality of different culture or a mosaic of different culture. But I do want to take issue with one point here, which is that Indians have never, in a sense, reached that nadir where we're, in a sense, seeing ourselves as a cultural group. I think attempts were being made. Maybe it's probably not as developed as maybe in a sense that some of the African organizations today, have developed that idea and can debate it and articulate it. We don't have that. And I think, again, coming back to this statement that all politics is culture and all culture is politics, we have to look at a historical evolution of how these things develop. And my point here is that political organization has played a significant role in silencing those voices. And I will give you a couple of examples, or at least one, which stands out in my mind. If we're talking about the PPP, we do have or had Indian voice within that political party, right? There were many debate. If you look at Mohan Ragbir's book between, let's say, Chetty and J.B. Singh, for instance, they have talked a lot about culture and what that means, and the issue between culture and communism and so on. So all of those discussions were going on. The name Balram Singh Rai would also ring a bell with the older generations. He was a strong Indian voice. But the point that I made originally was that the PPP felt that this was a tradition that they could not sustain, because that would create a problem. Because, one of the interesting things that all of us can do, when you go back and look at the speeches that were being made, you look at all of Chetty's speeches, for instance, and I'll get to the point in a second. A lot of his speeches has to do with, promoting communism and speaking about one Guyana and so on. When you look at the speeches that Barnum was making, if you can get your hand on, let's say, Nascimento's Destiny to Mole, there was always a recognition that Guyana is a divided country and it has to be addressed. Now we know Barnum, throughout the ICJ report and didn't really care to address those issues because he wanted to remain in power. But the point is that you do have that tradition where the issue of ethnicity has always been dominant and there were opportunities to address it, right? And my point, and I'm going back again, to the current situation, contemporary world, where we're trying to figure out what is the problem for a regime, a government that is supported by generation of Indians. Why is it that they so adamantly refuse to call this Indian Arrival Day?
The question is, and please answer it, why there is not, or why there was not a Guyana within the PPP? That's the answer. Why wasn't there between the 50s and 1988 when Dr. Jagan had his epiphany? Why wasn't, that's the question, that's the answer. Why wasn't there a Guyana? You see, Barnum always had a Guyana to nudge him. When Mr. Barnum went to Africa, Guyana was there. Guyana went in advance and met these African governments and so on. When Mr. Barnum came back with the Arusha Declaration type, what kind of corporatism? The whole co-op idea and what have you. Yeah, that's right.
Well, we don't have a Guyana, but we do have a Ravi Dev who has been very articulate and vocal in advocating for Indian Arrival Day. But you don't need to have a Guyana in this day and age.
No, I'm talking, the thing is, there was not that tradition, Beto, that from the 50s to the 60s, that tradition was destroyed because at that juncture, Dr. Jagan saw anything of culture, and Indian culture especially, as backward and retrograde. I mean, give him credit. He felt he was at a higher plane. He was beyond that. And therefore, you're just pulling the people downwards. Now, in my estimation, Burnham had certain aspirations. And here we have the chairman of the Burnham Foundation may answer. Burnham may have aspired coming back from England with his Churchillian accent and all that, in terms of British culture. But at least a Guyana within the party was there to remind him that the base, did not necessarily march to that beat. And I think it's a very important question. So after 92 now, then it's a whole different ball game because you're now back in office, you have a majority, and you don't need to genuflect to any other grouping out there.
Yeah, but then I mean, my question, I get that, right? I get that tradition, and it's true. Historically, there was not that strong Indian voice, right? We don't have organization like ACDA and so on to articulate those strong Indian position. But I'm asking a simple question, which is that, okay, you've seen the argument being made and you're now in office and you can do something, that will guarantee support, especially with the local elections coming up, or whether the next election is 2024, 25, you don't need pressure from an Indian organization to push you. And again, I'm being specific about the Indian Arrival Day issue. So if you understand that and you recognize that we are a multicultural society and everybody has a role to play, because I'm sure the PPP will come out, with a statement about, Arrival Day. The Portuguese were here, the Chinese were here. I'm hoping they will be as forthright as President Granger to recognize the actual name of the people who came. So I'm making the simple point. Yes, historically we don't have that, but that's in the past. We can go back and talk about the division caused by the Europeans and go way back and to 1830. But I'm saying at this juncture where we are, I don't understand why it is so difficult for a government, given all the debate and all the issues that has been raised about Indian Arrival Day, why the continued refusal to acknowledge this. And again, we don't need any kind of pressure to force them to do this. And I don't have a rationale. I don't understand what is the thinking in the minds of those people. I have an idea, but they have not made any public statements that we can look at and say, look, well, maybe you have a point. But there is nothing, there is an absolute silence from those in power in terms of these calls that are being made to put the word Indian in Indian arrival. And that is what is troubling to me. And that's the simple point I'm trying to make.
Vincent,
What's of interest to me here is this. That I think in the Indo-Guyanese community, in some regards, class, more attention was paid to class. And that may have impacted what you're referring to.
Well, Vincent, but that's a historical analysis, right? And I get that, but I mean, this current regime is not about class. I mean, it's far from that. So
I don't agree with you. I don't agree with you.
Okay, well, let me hear your explanation.
That this regime is about class. It's largely about class, and what the comfort is. If you take the African Guyanese community and the way it has evolved, the institutions that supports ethnic enclaves, in a sense, were killed during the period of slavery. And there had to be a conscious renaissance, conscious rebuilding of those institutions. And people like Guyana played a role in trying to rebuild those institutions so that one could be able to practice one's culture and have identity and things like that. But I think that in the instance of the Indo-Guyanese, the extent to which the Hindu religion continued to be practiced, and the extent to which the Hindu religion, in a sense, is hegemonic, it's hegemonic, it's essentially for Hindus and Indians, is the extent to which, even with the presence of the problems which we're referring to, in the Indian community, they were able to retain, quote unquote, their Indianness by virtue of the retention from the time of arrival on to present day of their religious organization. So they have had and continue to have an institution. Now I know Ravi is going to respond to this, because though they have had and continue to have an institution, in society there's also sometimes a natural process of creolization. And some people see that as a threat. That's another debate. So that we do have some instances in the Guyanese society where Indian leadership, recognizing that problem, have in fact sought to get involved in the ensuring that though there is the Hindu religion and all of that, that the invasion of Creole culture, so to speak, is pushed back by a conscious understanding of who the Indian is, what his heritage is, and what his culture is. So you've had some of that. And I think I would suggest that you guys, Ravi and others, represent an attempt at that. But unlike the African Guyanese community, the institution remained. They came, they retained, and so they could literally sometimes ignore the national situation as they continue to practice their culture in their enclaves. However, in the Indian community, there was a class situation, which sometimes is even a reflection of the classes that came from India, that sought from a class position to be classist in a manner to allow the supremacy of that class And that could have been to the detriment of the working class, so to speak, the ordinary Indian, the ones who were not the locals and those guys, like the ones who thought, you know what, we're going to continue bringing Indians here, we're going to have a large number of them, but we're going to do it in such a way that we are able to build a ruling class, upper class of Indians that does not necessarily interfere with the religious structures because of the nature of the Indian society and the way in which they relate to hierarchy.
Let me just add, if I might just add this, just one last to conclude, I think, this portion. We have not much time. I would conclude this. You see, what Vincent said, you see, the Africans that came after slavery was abolished, those 13,000, they pretty much kept, and it was there to be nurtured and given a rebirth in places like Hope Town and some of the villages, because we know those villages. One good thing about it, we know, and you can go back to the dispatches and see where those Africans were sent. And it is not coincidental that those are the African village that still, have that kwekwe and all the other customs. Not many came to Ifat for whatever reason. To come back to the point, though, this is the difference that I want to conclude with this. Mr. Guyana embarked on that renaissance of African culture from a political perspective. So coming back to Beto's exhortation that we must be fixated in the present. So the present African Renaissance historically occurred simultaneously with the political struggle. So for example, to be a member of ASCRIA, you had to take 6 months worth of classes in African history told from a particular ideological perspective. The Indians never had that. The Indian political vehicle never saw that as important, and in fact downplayed that it was backward and retrogressive. And that is the difference. That's why Vincent can now have 65, is it 65, Vincent? I hear the numbers are dwindling. But the point is, though, that that's the difference, that mobilization happened in the present. So therefore, you could have in Wisma, you could have the group there that was very politically sensitized and would strike against Mr. Burnham because of their cultural but political consciousness. You understand? So anyhow, I want to just say that is the answer to me, that within the 50s to the 80s, 1988, Dr. Jagan consciously kept out those elements from the PPP because he felt it was a retrograde step. And we must remember that in 1962, Ms. Rajkumari Singh and others were literally thrown out of the party. Don't forget, she was on one of the committees in the PPP, and she was thrown out after 62. At the same moment that Mr. Guyana made his choice as to what was good for Indian African people, Rajkumari and others was making the same point about what was good for Indians. Rajkumari Singh, Balwant Singh, and others made that same move, but they were sidelined. Sorry, Vishnu.
Just one quick comment. You did say that of a UC Guyana or an ASCRIA in the Indian community, but there was a Ravi Dev and others who, when pushed against the wall, the political establishment did act in granting Arrival Day, not Indian Arrival Day, and they also approved a campus of UG under quarantine, which they had always opposed historically. Well, not historically, but they opposed it, and they were pushed into a corner, and they accepted it. But Vincent also said, and I think he's right, that although there was no equivalent of an askriya, there were religious Indian Hindu or Islamic religious institutions that would have played the role of an askriya in pushing the political establishment as well.
Well, we can go to the records. I wouldn't.
Ramharack, any
I
comment on
wouldn't
that?
debate that. Yeah.
No, I think what ROAR has done is to help to, I don't want to use the word federalize to upset Vincent, but decentralize some of those institutions. And I think the Burmese institution, UG, was part of, I mean, I will humbly take some credit as being part of ROAR for that. But I know we're coming to the end, but I just want to make a quick point, and hopefully we can continue with this discussion. I think when I talk about the idea of, the PPP looking at things from a class perspective, which is the reason why, they would see anything dealing with parochial issues of race and ethnicity as being backward. I think that was a dominant view, with Shetty's PPP. But I think that philosophy or that perspective of how to deal, with race and ethnicity still remains with the PPP, except that it's not being seen from a Marxist perspective. And that's the point I was trying to make. But the other issue which continues from the time the PPP had existed to the current time, and this is really what makes the struggle, to have a Guyana, for instance, or to articulate that Indian Arrival Day, is that the PPP continues to co-op, whether it's those religious organizations. There really are no independent organization outside of the PPP that articulate because of that strong control that they have over society. So it is going to be a prolonged struggle. Hopefully it doesn't come to that because we're nearing, again, May 5th in 2 days. But I do believe that the class perspective, as I said, that Shetty had about looking at these ethnic groups is the continuation without the class, right? The Marxist analysis. It's a continuation of that perspective because anyone who articulate an Indian perspective, and you can, I can tell you, if this is the challenge, any Indian organization that goes out there to say, look, we are going to represent Indian interests is going to be chopped down, it's going to be co-opted, and it's going to be destroyed by the PPP. And that is really where the challenge comes in, because they will not allow those organizations, to exist. We can talk about, Donald Ramatar, having a campaign in front of Mr. Dev's home because he articulated an Indian vision with ROAR, but you can have that discussion at another time. But I simply want to leave folks here with the point that anything that seems to have an Indian perspective, it's not being seen as legitimate, and I don't see people in this government making that argument or taking that position because it's a throwback to what the PPP under Shetty had established, that anything or any discussion about race and ethnicity is something anathema, and it shouldn't be done.
All right, so we just
I would argue that the PPP has turned out to be politically communist. We'll say Marxist, to differentiate here. Politically communist, but economically capitalist. I think that is where they are at. So that their control systems and all of that are still a reflection of their communist outlook. So they're trained communist.
That sounds like cooperative socialism.
No. But economically, I would say they're capitalists. And it's a funny marriage, but that's what they have turned out to be. And that's what facilitates what you
have any other point about this overarching theme of Indian Arrival Day before we conclude? Vincent, Ravi?
Well, I think we all support Indian Arrival Day, and I hope Vincent will help us campaign to get that day recognized as Indian Arrival Day.
Obviously, Indian Arrival Day is a valid, legitimate day, and it should be embraced by all Guyanese. But the struggle for Indian Arrival Day has to be seen in the context of party, which on one hand is communist, on the other hand tries to create a facade of being democratic, and at the same time is heavily capitalist. And so it is in that milieu of contradictory things that this question of Indian Arrival Day is caught up. I think it's caught up in that.
Well, I would simply say, Vishnu, in conclusion, that you guys are all social scientists, and there's a notion in social science of hysteresis. There's a lag, in terms of certain events playing out. So and no, seriously, I think there is a lag. I think what Vincent is pointing out, there are these contradictions, and inevitably, I am no Marxist, but I have to agree that material conditions inevitably will have a role to play in terms of what we may call some of your cultural, superstructural positions. So I see the PPP will have to move. It may be there may be that hysteresis in terms of that lag, but I see them moving. They'll have to move because of that same capitalist question. In the past, there used to be the notion that once you get to a level of 5,000 US in income, the people get to that, they will begin to assert themselves more. And I can see that happening in Guyana too, that as Guyana develops, and it will develop no matter what you say, I think that will be one push factor in pushing change. People will become more confident in talking about their aspirations, about their identity, about what ought to be. But also, I think the leadership of the PPP, I think this generation, and I can see it in Irfan Ali, is much more confident. It may look superficial, but for a president of this republic, as an Indian man, a young man, to take Seven Curry in a leaf and sane with his hand and eat it in public, and to be on that stage and wind on real Bengali Babu style, I think it says something. And I would like to believe, to use Vincent's term, he always chastises me that he's not any Marxist, but I'll use his term. He uses the words, which is that I think the quantitative will affect the qualitative soon. And I see change coming, right? I see change coming, and I see Indian Arrival Day coming, if not this year, then I see it by next year. I'm putting my reputation on the line here. I see it coming. And I think it's representative of that recognition that you can't ignore. You can't ignore race and subjugate it under class, even in a pretend way. And the fact that Brigadier Mark Phillips, Prime Minister Mark Phillips, could say that he represents or he was running an organization and he was Afrocentric in his running of that, I think it tells a lot. And that is part of the qualitative. Thank you. I'm hopeful.
I also I'm in agreement. I see it coming, and maybe next week it may come. It probably come sooner than later. Any other final points before we close? I guess none. So listen, this whole concept, this whole idea of Indian Arrival Day, we borrow it. We borrow it. The Trinidadians first started it. And I want to pay tribute to a man, a scholar, a writer, a journalist who died 2 weeks ago, Trinidadian, who pioneered this concept and the struggle for Indian Arrival Day in Trinidad, and he eventually became Indian Arrival Day in 1995. I want to pay tribute to him. He died 2 weeks ago, Sri Ramdat Jagisar. Yeah. And so because of him, we borrowed his ideas. And launch this struggle in Guyana for Indian Arrival Day. Gentlemen, I want to thank you all.
Mike was in saying this, notwithstanding the name ascribed to the day, I think if one checks carefully, you will find that the majority of Indians do treat it Indian Arrival Day And you really sometimes, and Ravi would know in law, is sometimes when something exists, in fact, although it may not exist in law.
Yeah, I think you're right. Almost all Indians call it Indian Arrival Day.
Oh.
Yeah.
Very good, Vincent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much,
All
gentlemen.
right, gentlemen.
Wonderful program. Great
Right.
discussion. So glad we have had it.
Yeah.
And
Take
see you
care.
all again very, very soon. Do enjoy your holiday. Indian Arrival Day this Friday, an extended weekend in Guyana. And all the best. Good night.